Our scripture reading this morning is from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 9, and this is in the New Revised Standard Version. It says, "You yourselves know, brother and sisters, that our coming to you was not in vain. But though we had already suffered and been shamefully mistreated at Philippi, as you know, we had courage in our God to declare to you the gospel of God, in spite of great opposition. For our appeal does not spring from deceit or impure motives or trickery. But just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the message of the gospel, even so we speak, not to please mortals, but to please God who tests our heart. As you know, and as God is our witness, we never came with words of flattery or with a pretext for greed, nor did we seek praise from mortals, whether from you or from others, though we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. So deeply do we care for you that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. You remember our labor and toil, brothers and sisters. We worked night and day so that we might not burden any of you while we proclaimed to you the gospel of God." Have you ever had something important to say, but there were too many other voices that were nothing but distraction? For me, it happened the other day, only in reverse. David called me to talk about next week's worship service, but I had 4 grandkids, one of which was crying, and a small dog all running around the house, screaming, and I was unable to hear David's message. In many ways, this is what's happening with Paul in Thessalonica. But before we go on, let's have some fun facts about the Bible. Did you know that 1 Thessalonians is believed to be the earliest document in the New Testament? It may have been written as early as 41 CE. This letter was written probably 20 to 30 years prior to the Gospel of Mark, which was the first gospel to be written. And then 1 Thessalonians is also the earliest of Paul's writings. In the Bible, Paul's letters are arranged by size, not the earliest to the latest. If so, 1 Thessalonians would be first and Romans would be last. Anyway, enough about my nerd Bible stuff. Let's move on to Paul and the Thessalonians. This Thursday at lunch and lectionary, Tom Creighton said that if not for Paul and his missions, Christianity might have never moved throughout the Mediterranean and would have died an obscure cult. But Paul was on a mission from God. Thessalonica, one of the cities that Paul chose for his mission, was a major port city and the capital of Macedonia. Paul usually chose large urban areas where he would have the greatest opportunity to meet and address potential converts. He would stay in the community for a certain amount of time, converting Gentiles to Christianity, which wasn't even called Christianity yet, and then move on to the next urban area. Now, one of the biggest unanswered questions that scholars have is, how was Paul able to convert so many people? They wonder what he said that was so impactful, but their questions remain unanswered. There are no scripts of what Paul said, no outline with bullet points and italics that stress emphasis. There are, however, clues as to how Paul was able to convert so many people. First, Paul was emboldened. He emboldened himself with courage in God and made sure that the Thessalonians knew where his courage came from. In today's lectionary text, Paul asked the Thessalonians to remember how, before he came to their city, he had been mistreated elsewhere. And while the letter does not tell us how, Acts 16 tells us that Paul and his friends had been stripped of their clothing, had been beaten with rods, and then imprisoned. It could be that Paul appeared in Thessalonica immediately after this incident, still battered and bruised. Or it could be that the Thessalonians had heard rumors about what had happened. But regardless, Paul said that he and his companions, Silvanus and Timothy, still, despite that beating and that mistreatment, had courage in God to declare the gospel of God in spite of great opposition. Paul wanted to remind them of his own courage in God so that when they needed it, they too would have the courage in God. Next, Paul then declared the gospel of God. The gospel of God. The good news about God. Once again, we don't have a script, but Paul may have told the Thessalonians about his own personal story. Or being Jewish, Paul may have recounted the story of Moses and how God liberated the Hebrew people. But whatever Paul told them, he spoke boldly about his beliefs. Then, while Paul may have encountered people as he stood on the street corner, which isn't likely, or while he was at the synagogue, these scenarios are not very likely. You know, the street corner gig is not very fruitful. People don't want to stand and have deep theological conversations on a street corner. And Paul, being a Jew, did not need to convert the Jews at the synagogue. His mission was for the Gentiles. More likely, we are told in 1 Thessalonians 2:9, that Paul and his friends labored and toiled. They worked day and night. Was it while they were working, while they were being in relationship with one another and working together to build a community, that Paul shared the gospel of God? This really is the most likely scenario. And finally, this letter tells us that Paul's intentions were well established. They were not based on impure motives. They were not based on financial reasons. Paul was authentically Paul. So Paul went to Thessalonica with courage in God. He spoke boldly. He worked hard while establishing relationships and was his authentic self. Now, despite all of Paul's hard work, once Paul left the cities where he had established these communities, there were other voices that came along with different messages. Messages that were distractions as far as Paul was concerned. Some of these were Stoics and some were cynics and others were pagans. And Paul wanted to make sure that his message remained clear over all of these distracting voices. We know what that is like, right? Those distracting voices. NASA, yes, the NASA we all think about, compiled a list of articles to show that there is scientific consensus on the issue of climate change. It says climate warming trends over the past century are extremely likely due to human activities. National Geographic says increasing heat, changing rain and snow patterns, shifts in plant communities, and other climate-related changes have vastly increased the likelihood that fires will start more often and burn more intensely and widely than they have in the past. These voices are very clear in their message, but then other voices appear and they are complete drivel. They are utter nonsense. They say, you got to take care of the floors. You know, the floors of the forest, very important. We can't be sure about climate change. Climate change is natural. And in the meantime, this drivel is causing real damage and is a distraction to the work that must be done to combat climate change and to combat forest fires like those that are occurring throughout our country and in Colorado right now. And Dr. Anthony Fauci, a physician and immunologist and director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, said a deadly disease called COVID-19 has erupted around the world, and the most important way to prevent the spread of the disease is to wear masks, to wash your hands, and to socially distance. It is a clear message with a clear voice. But then other voices appear once again with drivel and distraction. This is a hoax. Masks are dangerous. He's a disaster. More than 500,000 people would be dead if Fauci were in charge. While these statements are utter nonsense, people believe these voices. And the drivel has caused more than 220,000 deaths and counting. And this type of drivel is not just happening in the political, scientific, and environmental arenas. It occurs in Christianity today. I read on Facebook the other day a meme that said, "No pastor can support same-sex marriage, homosexuality, transgender, and abortion and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ." It's nonsense and it's damaging. And I wondered who would respond to it. And I realized that my voice was required. I was the one that needed to be louder than the drivel. So how do we, as progressive Christians, drown out the drivel and be a voice of reason? We must be Paul's. First, we must know the gospel of God. If God is still speaking, which I believe to be true, what is the good news of God in our own lives and in our community? We can tell people about the God of Moses or the God of Abraham and Sarah, or we can be more compelling and tell people about the God that we know, the God that is with us, the God that is still speaking. Larry Ricketts will tell you that the gospel of God resides in community. Edie McDaniels will tell you that the good news of God resides in beauty. Laura Harris will tell you that the gospel of God resided in her husband, Guy. Bob Lederer finds God in memories created with old friends. And I find the gospel of God in the laughter of my grandchildren. What is your gospel of God? Second, we must be willing to speak boldly and authentically. We must have our own courage in God. If we, as progressive Christians, are not providing a clear voice that is telling people that we believe love is love, that science is real, that no human is illegal, that Black lives matter, that women's rights are human rights, and that radical hospitality includes everyone, and that we love our neighbors no matter who they are or where they are on life's journey, and that we believe all of this because Jesus has shown them to be true, then the drivel wins. And finally, we must share a message of hope to people who are swimming in this toxic soup of drivel. Paul brought hope to the Thessalonians by not only sharing the gospel of God, but by being in relationship with them and sharing himself. Verse 8 of our text just so beautifully states this. Paul said, "So deeply do we care for you that we are determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us." Paul was busy building community. He taught them how to care for each other by being gentle with each other and caring for one another like a nurse tenderly cares for her own children. Paul was busy sharing love. One commentator actually called Paul a soul sharer. We need more soul sharers in this world. So how do we drown out the drivel? We have courage in God. We share the good news of God. We speak boldly and authentically, and we share a message of hope. And as we become soul sharers, gospel of God tellers, and community builders, our voice will be clear, and we will help drown out the drivel. Amen.